The first time I measured a mailbox, I felt the satisfying click of truth. 42 3/4 inches. 3/4 of an inch below regulation. The Hendersons at 1247 Maple Grove Lane had been living a lie for God knows how long, their cheerful red mailbox standing there like a monument to chaos, mocking everything our homeowners association stood for. I am Margaret Pemberton, and I have become the guardian of order in Willowbrook Estates. It started innocuously enough. I'd been on the HOA board for 3 years, dutifully attending monthly meetings where we discussed the usual infractions, lawn height violations, unauthorized fence colors, the occasional Christmas decoration that lingered too far into January. But it wasn't until Harold Grimsby moved into 1203 that I discovered my true calling. Harold was what you might charitably call creative with his property modifications. Within a week of moving in, he'd installed a mailbox that looked like it belonged in Dr. Seuss's fever dream, purple with yellow polka dots, topped with a miniature windmill that squeaked in the breeze. The board convened an emergency session, and I was tasked with reviewing our mailbox regulations. That's when I found it, Section 4.7b of our Community Covenant, buried on page 43 of the original HOA documentation. All mailboxes shall be mounted at a height of 43 inches from ground level to the bottom of the mailbox receptacle, with a tolerance of plus or minus 1/2 inch. 43 inches. Plus or minus half an inch. I read those words 3 times, each repetition sending a strange thrill through my chest. Here was specificity. Here was order. Here was something I could measure, quantify, and enforce with mathematical precision. The next morning, I drove to Home Depot and bought a retractable measuring tape, the good kind with a magnetic tip and clear markings down to the 16th of an inch. I also purchased a small notebook with a red leather cover. Red seemed appropriate for recording violations. My first official measurement was Harold's monstrosity, 39 1/4 inches. I wrote the address, date, and measurement in my notebook with a flourish that felt almost ceremonial. Then I walked to the next house. The Patel's mailbox, 44 inches. 1/2 an inch over regulation. The Johnsons, 41 7/8 inches. 1 1/8 inches under. By lunch, I had documented 17 violations on Maple Grove Lane alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed calculating the magnitude of the problem. Willowbrook Estates had 347 properties. If Maple Grove Lane was representative, and I had no reason to believe it wasn't, we were looking at a compliance rate of roughly 15%. 15%. We were living in mailbox anarchy. I started carrying the measuring tape everywhere. Not just for official HOA business, you understand, but for my own peace of mind. I would measure restaurant tables to see if they were level. I measured the height of crosswalk signals. I measured the distance between parking spaces at the grocery store. The world, I discovered, was full of imprecision masquerading as acceptable standards. But the mailboxes were my primary responsibility. I developed a system. Monday through Friday, I would cover one street per day, beginning at 7 a.m. sharp. This timing wasn't arbitrary. I had noticed that many postal workers began their routes around 8:30, and I wanted to complete my measurements before their arrival. The last thing I needed was some government employee interfering with my work. My method was thorough. I would park at one end of the street, remove my supplies from the passenger seat, measuring tape, red notebook, digital camera for documentation, and a thermos of coffee, and begin my systematic survey. Each mailbox received the same treatment, a careful measurement from the ground to the bottom of the receptacle, recorded to the nearest eighth of an inch, photographed with the measuring tape visible for evidence. The violations were staggering. Mrs. Chun at 1156 had her mailbox mounted at 45 1/4 inches, 2 1/4 inches over regulation. The Kowalskis at 1171 were sitting at 39 3/4 inches, a full 3 1/4 inches too low. These weren't minor discrepancies. These were flagrant disregards for community standards. I began issuing notices. Not harsh ones, mind you. I'm not unreasonable. My initial letters were quite cordial. Dear homeowner, during a routine compliance check, I discovered that your mailbox installation does not meet the specifications outlined in Section 4.7b of our Community Covenant. Please adjust the height to 43 inches, plus or minus 1/2 inch, within 30 days. Thank you for your cooperation in maintaining our neighborhood standards. The responses were disappointing. Some homeowners ignored the notices entirely. Others called the main HOA office to complain, forcing me to spend valuable measurement time on the phone, explaining the importance of uniform mailbox heights. A few residents actually had the audacity to argue with me directly. Take Mr. Morrison at 1134 Elm Street. When I informed him that his mailbox was sitting at 41 5/8 inches, he actually laughed. As if precision were some kind of joke. Lady, he said, it's been at that height for 12 years. The mailman's never complained. The mailman, I informed him, is not responsible for enforcing our community covenant. I am. But it's worked fine. Mail goes in, I take mail out. What's the problem? I stared at him, momentarily speechless. What's the problem? The problem was that we lived in a civilized community with established standards. The problem was that if everyone decided they could just mount their mailboxes at whatever height felt convenient, we'd evolve into chaos. The problem was that 41 5/8 inches was not 43 inches. Mr. Morrison, I said, standards exist for a reason. If we don't enforce them consistently, they become meaningless. He shook his head and went back inside. His mailbox remained at 41 5/8 inches. That's when I realized I needed to take a more comprehensive approach. I began keeping detailed records. Not just measurements, but behavioral patterns. I noticed that the postal workers often had to bend or stretch awkwardly to reach improperly positioned mailboxes. This was a clear safety issue that no one was addressing. I documented these observations, photographing postal workers as they struggled with non-compliant installations. The postal workers became an unexpected variable in my research. I noticed they had their own patterns, different routes, different times, different physical capabilities. Carmen Rodriguez, who covered the west side of our development, was approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall. She had to stretch significantly for mailboxes over 44 inches and bend awkwardly for those below 41 inches. This represented a clear ergonomic hazard. But here's what really disturbed me. Not only were the postal workers not reporting these violations, they seemed to be enabling them. I watched Carmen deliver mail to Mrs. Chen's 45 1/4 inch mailbox without so much as a complaint. She simply stretched up, deposited the mail, and moved on as if flagrant violation of community standards were perfectly acceptable. This revelation kept me awake for 3 nights straight. The United States Postal Service, a federal agency, was actively participating in the degradation of our neighborhood standards. This was bigger than I had initially understood. I decided I needed more data. If I was going to present a case to the full HOA board, I needed comprehensive documentation. I began arriving at my measurement locations earlier, positioning myself to observe the mail delivery process firsthand. The first morning I tried this approach, I parked at the corner of Oak Street at 6:15 a.m., armed with coffee, my measurement equipment, and a pair of binoculars I'd borrowed from our neighbor's garage sale. The plan was to document the complete interaction between postal workers and non-compliant mailboxes. At 7:30, I made my measurements as usual. Oak Street had 11 violations out of 23 properties, a compliance rate of just over 50%, better than average, but still unacceptable. At 8:45, Carmen's postal truck turned onto Oak Street. I watched through the binoculars as she moved from house to house, and what I observed was deeply troubling. Not only was she failing to report the height violations, she was adapting her behavior to accommodate them. At 1847 Oak Street, where the mailbox sat at 39 1/4 inches, she actually squatted down to reach the receptacle. At 1823, with its 45-inch installation, she stood on her tiptoes. This was enabling behavior. By accommodating these violations instead of reporting them, Carmen was allowing non-compliant homeowners to believe their installations were acceptable. She was, in effect, undermining the entire regulatory framework that kept our community functioning. I documented everything. Time stamps, photographs, detailed notes about each interaction. When Carmen finished Oak Street, I followed her truck at a discreet distance to observe her behavior on other streets. The pattern was consistent: accommodation, enabling, and a complete failure to uphold community standards. That evening, I called the post office. "Hello," I said to the supervisor who answered. "I'd like to report a concern about mail delivery in our neighborhood." "What seems to be the problem?" "Your employee Carmen Rodriguez is failing to report mailbox height violations in Willowbrook Estates." There was a pause. "I'm sorry, did you say mailbox height violations?"
Yes.
"Our community covenant specifies that mailboxes must be mounted at 43 inches, plus or minus half an inch. Many residents are not in compliance, and your employee is enabling these violations by continuing to deliver mail instead of reporting the infractions." Another pause, longer this time. "Ma'am, our mail carriers deliver mail to whatever mailbox is present. We don't measure mailbox heights." "But you should," I insisted. "If you reported these violations, residents would be forced to come into compliance." "That's not how mail delivery works." I tried to explain the importance of community standards, the ergonomic hazards of improperly positioned mailboxes, and the Postal Service's civic responsibility to uphold local regulations. The supervisor listened politely and promised to look into it, which I recognized as bureaucratic code for, "I'm going to hang up now and never think about this again." Clearly, I was on my own. I intensified my efforts. Instead of covering one street per day, I began making multiple passes through the neighborhood, checking for new violations and monitoring previously cited properties. I invested in better equipment: a digital caliper for more precise measurements, a professional-grade camera with a macro lens, and a small laptop for field data entry. My documentation became increasingly sophisticated. I created spreadsheets tracking compliance rates by street, by property age, and by mailbox style. I calculated the average deviation from regulation, 2.3 inches, and the standard deviation, 1.7 inches. I mapped violation clusters and identified repeat offenders. The data revealed disturbing patterns. Newer residents were slightly more likely to be in compliance, suggesting that older installations had simply drifted out of regulation over time due to settling or gradual loosening of mounting hardware. This meant that even previously compliant mailboxes were gradually becoming violations through neglect. More troubling was the discovery of what I termed creeping noncompliance. Residents who received citations sometimes adjusted their mailboxes, but not to the correct height. Instead, they would make minimal adjustments that brought them closer to compliance without actually achieving it. The Hendersons, for example, raised their mailbox from 42 3/4 inches to 42 7/8 inches, still a quarter inch below regulation. This pattern suggested a fundamental lack of respect for precision. These residents were treating the regulations as suggestions rather than requirements. They were trying to pacify me with cosmetic adjustments while maintaining their essential noncompliance. I realized I needed to establish a more visible presence in the neighborhood. I began conducting my measurements during peak activity hours, when residents were leaving for work or returning home. This served two purposes. It demonstrated that violations were being actively monitored, and it provided opportunities for educational outreach. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," I would call out cheerfully as she backed out of her driveway. "Just checking your mailbox compliance. You're sitting at 44 1/8 inches, 5/8 over regulation." Some residents appreciated this proactive approach. Mrs. Thompson at 1445 Birch Lane actually thanked me for my diligence and promised to adjust her mailbox the following weekend. She did, though only to 44 inches exactly, still 1 inch over regulation, but progress nonetheless. Others were less receptive. Mr. Chen accused me of harassment and threatened to call the police. I explained that I was simply performing my duties as an HOA board member, but he seemed to think there was something inappropriate about measuring mailboxes in broad daylight on public property. Some people have very strange notions about privacy. The police visit was actually quite productive. Officer Martinez was polite and professional, and I took the opportunity to educate him about our community regulations. I showed him my documentation, explained the importance of maintaining standards, and demonstrated my measurement technique. He seemed impressed by the thoroughness of my approach, though he did suggest that I might want to dial it back a little to avoid further complaints. I considered his advice carefully. Perhaps my approach was too subtle. If residents weren't taking the violations seriously, maybe I needed to be more direct about the consequences of non-compliance. I decided to focus on repeat offenders. The Johnsons at 1398 Maple Grove Lane had received 4 separate notices over 8 months. Their mailbox had actually gotten worse, dropping from 41 7/8 inches to 41 1/2 inches. This wasn't accidental settling. This was deliberate non-compliance. I began documenting their property more frequently. Every 3 days, I would stop by to measure their mailbox and photograph any changes, or lack thereof. I also started noting other potential covenant violations. Their lawn edge wasn't perfectly straight. Their newspaper occasionally sat on the driveway past 10 a.m., and I was fairly certain their fence paint had faded below acceptable standards. One morning, I arrived at 1398 Maple Grove to find Mr. Johnson working in his garage. I seized the opportunity for direct engagement. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," I called out, approaching with my measuring tape. "Time for your weekly compliance check." He looked up from whatever project he was working on. "You've got to be kidding me." "I never kid about community standards," I replied, positioning my measuring tape against his mailbox. 41 1/4 inches. "You're getting worse." "Look, lady." Mrs. Pemberton. "Mrs. Pemberton, this is getting ridiculous. It's a mailbox. It holds mail. The mailman doesn't care about half an inch." "The mailman's preferences are irrelevant," I explained patiently. "Our community covenant specifies 43 inches, plus or minus half an inch. You're currently 1 3/4 inches below the minimum acceptable height. So what? What exactly is going to happen if I don't fix it?" I consulted my notebook. According to our covenant, continued noncompliance can result in escalating fines, starting at $50 and increasing by $25 per month until the violation is corrected. His face changed color slightly. "You're going to fine me over half an inch?" 1 3/4 inches, I corrected. "And yes, standards are meaningless if they're not enforced." That weekend, the Johnsons' mailbox was adjusted to exactly 43 inches. Success. Encouraged by this victory, I began implementing a more systematic enforcement approach. I created a tiered citation system. First notice, friendly reminder. Second notice, formal warning. Third notice, fine notification. And escalation to the full HOA board for continued noncompliance. I also started arriving earlier for my measurement rounds. The optimal time, I discovered, was between 6 and 6:30 a.m. This was early enough to complete my work before most residents left for work, but late enough for adequate lighting for photography. The early hour also minimized interruptions from residents who might want to argue about their violations. One morning in November, I was conducting measurements on Elm Street when I noticed something unusual. Carmen's postal truck was parked at the corner, but she wasn't making deliveries. She was sitting in the driver's seat, drinking coffee and watching me through her side mirror. I continued my work, documenting violations at 1456, 44 1/4 inches, 1461, 41 3/8 inches, and 1467, 39 inches, a particularly egregious violation. Carmen remained in her truck, observing. When I finished the street and returned to my car, she was waiting for me. "You're the mailbox lady," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Margaret Pemberton, HOA board member," I replied. "And you're Carmen Rodriguez, postal employee who fails to report community covenant violations." She laughed, which I found inappropriate given the serious nature of our conversation. "Listen, Mrs. Pemberton, I've been delivering mail for 15 years. Never once has anyone asked me to measure mailbox heights. That's part of the problem," I explained. "If postal workers took an active role in enforcement, compliance rates would improve dramatically." "You realize that's not my job, right?" "It should be. You interact with these mailboxes daily. You're in a unique position to identify violations and encourage compliance." Carmen shook her head. "Lady, I just deliver mail. If the mailbox is there and I can reach it, that's all I care about." "But what about ergonomic safety? You have to stretch and bend to accommodate improperly positioned mailboxes. You could file worker compensation claims. I could, she agreed, but I'm not going to.
Know why?
Because I'm a reasonable person who can adapt to minor variations in mailbox height without having an emotional breakdown. I found her attitude deeply troubling. Here was a federal employee, paid by taxpayer dollars, dismissing legitimate safety concerns and actively enabling the degradation of community standards. If our postal workers wouldn't take responsibility for maintaining order, who would? That night, I drafted a letter to the Postmaster General. The letter was 6 pages long and included charts showing compliance rates, photographs documenting ergonomic hazards, and a detailed analysis of the Postal Service's role in community covenant enforcement. I sent copies to our congressman, the regional postal supervisor, and the editor of our local newspaper. I never received a response from the Postmaster General, but the local newspaper printed a brief article about my concerns. The headline was "Local Woman Measures Mailboxes for HOA Compliance," which I felt understated the importance of the issue, but at least it brought public attention to the problem. The article prompted several phone calls to my home. Most were supportive fellow residents who appreciated someone finally taking community standards seriously. But a few were less encouraging. One caller suggested I needed to get a hobby, as if maintaining the integrity of our neighborhood weren't hobby enough. Another caller was more direct. "You're nuts, lady. It's a mailbox, not a federal crime." I hung up on that one. Some people simply don't understand the importance of precision and order. By December, I had documented violations at 234 properties. The compliance rate had improved slightly thanks to my enforcement efforts, but we were still looking at a 30% violation rate. Clearly, more aggressive measures were necessary. I decided to establish a permanent monitoring station. Using our second car, Harold rarely drove it anyway, I began positioning myself at strategic locations throughout the neighborhood for extended observation periods. This allowed me to document not just static violations, but behavioral patterns around mailbox usage. I discovered fascinating data. Residents with correctly positioned mailboxes, 42½ to 43½ inches, typically approached mail retrieval with confidence and efficiency. Those with improperly positioned mailboxes often displayed compensatory behaviors, stooping, stretching, or even using tools to reach their mail. More importantly, I observed that children in families with non-compliant mailboxes were learning incorrect behaviors. I watched 8-year-old Tommy Henderson struggle to reach his family's 45-inch mailbox, developing poor posture habits that could affect him for life. This wasn't just about community standards anymore, this was about child development. I began documenting these behavioral impacts in a supplementary report I titled "The Hidden Costs of Mailbox Noncompliance, a Community Health Assessment." The report included photographs, taken from public property, perfectly legal, behavioral observations, and projections about long-term ergonomic impacts. One morning in January, I was conducting extended surveillance from my monitoring position on Oak Street when I noticed unusual activity at 1847. This was the property with a 39¼ inch mailbox, well below regulation. A man I didn't recognize was working on the mailbox installation. I approached to investigate. "Excuse me," I called out. "Are you adjusting that mailbox height?" The man looked up. He was wearing a contractor's shirt and had professional tools. "Yeah, the homeowner hired me to raise it up a bit." Finally, someone was taking their violation seriously. "Excellent," I said. "The correct height is 43 inches from ground level to the bottom of the receptacle." "I'm just doing what the customer asked," he replied. "She said to make it so her back doesn't hurt when she gets the mail." This was promising, but I wanted to ensure proper compliance. I retrieved my measuring tape and waited while he worked. When he finished, I took a measurement. 42½ inches. 7/8 of an inch below regulation. "I'm sorry," I informed him, "but you're still 3/8 of an inch below the minimum acceptable height." He stared at me. "Lady, I just raised this thing 4 inches. The customer's happy, and frankly, so am I. I'm done here." "But it's still not compliant." "Not my problem." He packed his tools and drove away, leaving me standing next to a mailbox that was closer to compliance, but still technically in violation. This was exactly the kind of casual disregard for precision that was undermining our entire system. I left a notice for the homeowner explaining that while her recent adjustment was appreciated, final compliance required an additional 3/8 of an inch of height. I also included a diagram showing the proper measurement technique, in case she wanted to verify the work herself. 3 days later, I returned to check on the situation. The mailbox hadn't been adjusted further, but there was a handwritten note taped to the post. "Stop measuring my mailbox, or I'm calling the police." I documented the threat and added it to my growing file of non-compliance incidents. Some residents, when faced with objective standards, resorted to intimidation rather than correction. This pattern suggested that the mailbox height violations were symptoms of a deeper problem, a fundamental lack of respect for community authority. I decided to present my findings to the full HOA board. The February board meeting was held in the community center conference room. I had prepared extensively, a 40-slide PowerPoint presentation, printed copies of my compliance database, and enlarged photographs of the most egregious violations. "Fellow board members," I began, "we are facing a crisis of standards in Willowbrook Estates." I presented my data methodically: violation rates by street, patterns of noncompliance, behavioral impacts on residents and postal workers, and the escalating disrespect for community authority. I showed photographs of children struggling to reach improperly positioned mailboxes and postal workers developing poor posture due to accommodation behaviors. In conclusion, I said after 37 minutes of presentation, I recommend immediate implementation of systematic mailbox height enforcement, including mandatory compliance inspections for all properties and escalating fines for continued violations. The room was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Board President Janet Morrison spoke up. "Margaret, this is very thorough. But don't you think you might be taking this a bit too seriously?" "Too seriously? We were talking about community standards, property values, and public safety. How could anyone take that too seriously?" "Janet," I replied, "standards are either enforced or they're meaningless. If we allow mailbox height violations to continue unchecked, what's next? Fence height violations? Lawn maintenance violations? Where does it end?" Board member Rick Patterson cleared his throat. "Margaret, I appreciate your diligence, but we've received several complaints about your enforcement methods. Some residents feel you're being a bit aggressive." Aggressive? I consulted my notes. I've been conducting measurements on public property during daylight hours. I've been polite and professional in all my interactions. How is enforcing our community covenant aggressive? "Well," said Patricia Williams, "there was the incident where you followed Carmen the mail carrier around the neighborhood." "I was documenting postal service enabling behavior," I explained. "It's all in my report. And the early morning measurements," added Rick. "Some residents find it disturbing to look out their window at 6 a.m. and see you measuring their mailbox." 6 a.m. is the optimal time for accurate documentation," I replied. "It minimizes interference and ensures consistent lighting for photography." The board members exchanged glances. I recognized the look. It was the same expression I'd seen from non-compliant residents when confronted with their violations. It was the look people get when faced with standards they'd rather ignore. "Margaret," Janet said carefully, "we appreciate your commitment to community standards. But perhaps we could scale back the mailbox enforcement a bit? Focus on other issues?" "What other issues are as quantifiable and objectively measurable as mailbox height?" I asked. "Lawn maintenance is subjective. Paint color is aesthetic preference. But mailbox height is mathematical. It's either 43 inches plus or minus half an inch, or it isn't." The meeting ended with a compromise. I would continue monitoring mailbox compliance, but I would limit my measurements to once per month per property and focus on the most egregious violations. This was disappointing, but at least they weren't asking me to stop entirely. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the resistance I was encountering. It seemed that even fellow board members didn't fully understand the importance of precise standards. They were treating mailbox height as if it were a minor cosmetic issue rather than a fundamental element of community order. but I wasn't deterred. If anything, the board's lukewarm response convinced me that my work was more important than ever. Someone had to maintain standards, even if that someone stood alone. I continued my measurements, though I adjusted my schedule slightly to avoid further complaints. Instead of 6 a.m., I began my rounds at 7 a.m. Instead of daily measurements, I moved to a 3-day rotation. These compromises were frustrating but strategic. I needed to maintain my ability to monitor compliance while avoiding bureaucratic interference. Spring brought new challenges. Several residents had apparently decided that winter was an acceptable excuse for mailbox neglect. I found violations that had worsened during the cold months, posts that had shifted due to freeze-thaw cycles, mounting hardware that had loosened due to temperature variations, and installations that had clearly been damaged by snow plows and not properly repaired. The most shocking discovery was at 1523 Birch Lane. The Kowalski family had apparently decided to replace their mailbox entirely during the winter. Their new installation was 37.5 inches high, 5.5 inches below regulation. This wasn't gradual noncompliance or seasonal settling. This was deliberate, flagrant violation of community standards. I issued an immediate citation and scheduled a follow-up measurement for the following week. When I returned, the mailbox hadn't been adjusted. I issued a second notice, this time with a photograph of the measuring tape, showing the exact violation. A week later, still 37.5 inches. I called Mr. Kowalski directly. Mr. Kowalski, this is Margaret Pemberton from the HOA board. I need to discuss your mailbox height violation. Oh, hi Mrs. Pemberton. Yeah, I got your notices. Then you understand that your installation is 5.5 inches below regulation? Look, we just had the thing installed by a professional. It's at the height the installer recommended. I don't care what the installer recommended, I replied. Our community covenant specifies 43 inches, plus or minus half an inch. Your mailbox is currently at 37.5 inches. It works fine. The mail carrier doesn't have any problems with it. The mail carrier's convenience is not the issue, I explained. Community standards exist for everyone's benefit. If every resident decided to mount their mailbox at whatever height seemed convenient, we'd have chaos. Mrs. Pemberton, with all due respect, it's just a mailbox. Just a mailbox. There it was again, the casual dismissal of standards that was destroying our community's integrity. Mr. Kowalski, I said, if it's just a mailbox, then adjusting it to the correct height shouldn't be a problem. He sighed. Fine. I'll look into it. But when I measured again the following week, the mailbox was still at 37.5 inches. I decided it was time to implement the escalating fine structure I'd proposed to the board. I prepared a formal notice of violation with a $50 fine for continued noncompliance, to be reviewed by the full board at our next meeting. The night before I was scheduled to present the Kowalski case to the board, I received a phone call from Janet Morrison. Margaret, we need to talk. About the Kowalski violation? I have all the documentation ready. About your role on the board. There was something in her tone that made me pay attention. What about my role? Margaret, the board has been discussing your approach to mailbox enforcement. We're concerned that it's becoming disruptive to the community. Disruptive? I'm enforcing our community covenant. You've received 17 complaints in the past month. Residents are saying you're harassing them. I'm measuring mailboxes on public property and issuing legitimate violations notices. How is that harassment? Some residents feel you're being excessive. Following mail carriers, taking photographs of their property, measuring their mailboxes multiple times per week. I moved to a 3-day rotation. I corrected. And the photographs are for documentation purposes. Jana was quiet for a moment. Margaret, the board has voted. We're asking you to step back from mailbox enforcement. The words hit me like cold water. Step back. Focus on other HOA responsibilities. Leave mailbox compliance to, well, we'll figure something out. You're removing me from mailbox enforcement? We think it would be best for everyone. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the red notebook that had become such an important part of my life. Months of careful documentation, systematic measurements, patient education of non-compliant residents, all dismissed because a few people couldn't handle being held to community standards. Janet, I said carefully, who's going to monitor compliance if I'm not doing it? Maybe we don't need to monitor it so closely. Maybe the current compliance rate is acceptable. Acceptable. A 30% violation rate was acceptable. This was exactly the kind of standards erosion I'd been fighting against. I can't support that decision, I told her. Margaret, you don't have a choice. The board voted. You're off mailbox duty. After I hung up, I sat for a long time thinking about what had just happened. The HOA board, people I had considered allies in maintaining community standards, had capitulated to resident complaints rather than supporting consistent enforcement. They were choosing popularity over principle. But here's what they didn't understand. I hadn't been measuring mailboxes because the board asked me to. I'd been doing it because it needed to be done. The board could remove me from official mailbox enforcement, but they couldn't stop me from conducting my own observations. I continued my measurements, though I was more discreet about it. Instead of carrying my official HOA clipboard, I used a small notebook that fit in my pocket. Instead of issuing formal violation notices, I kept personal records of non-compliance incidents. The work was just as important as it had ever been, perhaps more so now that official enforcement had been abandoned. 2 weeks after my conversation with Janet, I discovered something that vindicated everything I'd been doing. I was conducting routine measurements on Elm Street when I noticed that the Petersons' mailbox, previously a consistent violator at 41 3/4 inches, had been adjusted to exactly 43 inches. Mrs. Peterson was working in her garden, so I approached to congratulate her on achieving compliance. Mrs. Peterson, I wanted to thank you for adjusting your mailbox height. You're now at exactly 43 inches. Perfect compliance. She looked up from her flowers.
Oh, that.
Yeah, I finally got tired of bending over every time I got the mail. My back was killing me. I'm glad you're more comfortable, I replied. And now you're in full compliance with our community covenant. You know what, she said. You were right about the height thing. I never realized how much I was straining until we fixed it. My daughter visits on weekends, and she's noticed the difference too. This was exactly what I'd been trying to explain to people. Proper mailbox height wasn't arbitrary bureaucracy. It was about ergonomics, safety, and quality of life. Mrs. Peterson had discovered this through personal experience, but how many other residents were still struggling with poorly positioned mailboxes because official enforcement had been abandoned. That night, I made a decision. The HOA board might have removed me from official mailbox duty, but they couldn't stop me from helping individual residents understand the benefits of proper mailbox positioning. I would continue my measurements and expand my educational outreach efforts. I developed a new approach. Instead of issuing violation notices, I would offer free mailbox ergonomic assessments. I created a simple flyer explaining the health benefits of proper mailbox height and offering to help residents determine their optimal positioning. The response was better than I'd expected. 7 residents requested assessments in the first week. During each visit, I would measure their current installation, demonstrate the proper height, and explain the ergonomic benefits. Several residents made adjustments immediately after their assessment. Mrs. Chun, whose mailbox had been sitting at 45 1/4 inches, was particularly grateful. I never realized how much I was straining my shoulder, she said after adjusting to 43 inches. This feels so much more natural. The Rodriguez family at 1634 Oak Street had the opposite problem. Their mailbox was at 39 inches, requiring them to bend uncomfortably to retrieve mail. After their assessment and adjustment, Mr. Rodriguez told me his back pain had decreased significantly. These successes confirmed what I'd known all along. Proper mailbox height wasn't about arbitrary regulations. It was about helping people live more comfortably and safely. But not everyone appreciated my educational efforts. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in June. I was conducting a routine measurement on Maple Grove Lane when I heard shouting behind me.
Hey,
get away from my mailbox. I turned to see Mr. Johnson, the same Mr. Johnson whose mailbox I'd successfully brought into compliance months earlier, striding across his lawn toward me. His face was red, and he was carrying what appeared to be a garden hose. Good morning, Mr. Johnson, I called out cheerfully. Just checking your continued compliance. You're still at exactly 43 inches. Excellent work maintaining proper standards. I told you to stay away from my property. I'm on public property, I reminded him, indicating the sidewalk where I was standing. And your mailbox is actually in perfect compliance now. You should be proud. I don't care about compliance. I care about you measuring my mailbox every week like some kind of crazy person. His choice of words stung, but I maintained my professional demeanor. I understand that precision can seem excessive to some people, but community standards require consistent monitoring. That's when he turned on the garden hose. The water hit me squarely in the chest, soaking my clipboard and ruining my morning's documentation. I stood there, dripping, while Mr. Johnson continued to spray me with his hose. "Stop measuring my mailbox," he shouted over the sound of the water. "Stop measuring everyone's mailbox. Find something else to do with your life." I retreated to my car, water dripping from my clothes and my carefully maintained records. As I drove away, I could see other residents emerging from their houses to see what the commotion was about. Mrs. Patterson was standing on her front porch, shaking her head. The Hendersons were watching from their window, apparently finding the whole situation amusing. That evening, I received 3 phone calls. The first was from Janet Morrison. "Margaret, I heard about what happened with Jim Johnson today. He assaulted me with a garden hose while I was conducting lawful measurements on public property," I replied. "Margaret, you're not supposed to be conducting measurements anymore. We talked about this. I'm conducting voluntary ergonomic assessments for interested residents. Every week? At the same houses. Consistency is important for accurate data collection." Janet sighed. "Margaret, the board is meeting tomorrow night. We need to discuss this situation." The second call was from Officer Martinez. "Mrs. Pemberton, we received a complaint about harassment in your neighborhood." "Someone complained about being harassed? Who?" "Actually, ma'am, the complaint was about you. Several residents have called saying you're measuring their mailboxes obsessively and it's making them uncomfortable." "Officer Martinez, I'm performing a valuable community service. Proper mailbox height prevents ergonomic injuries and maintains property values. I understand your intentions are good, but some people feel you're being excessive. Maybe you could dial it back a little more?" The third call was from my sister Linda in Phoenix. "Margaret, I just got the strangest call from your neighbor. She said you got sprayed with a garden hose for measuring mailboxes. What's going on up there?" I tried to explain the importance of community standards, the resistance I was facing from non-compliant residents, and the board's failure to support consistent enforcement. Linda listened patiently, but I could tell she wasn't really understanding the significance of what was happening. "Margaret," she said finally, "maybe you should take a vacation. Come visit me in Arizona for a few weeks." "I can't leave now," I protested. "Summer is peak moving season. New residents need to understand proper mailbox positioning from the beginning." "Honey, it sounds like you're getting a little too wrapped up in this mailbox thing." Too wrapped up. As if precision and community standards were hobbies one could become too wrapped up in. The emergency board meeting was held the next evening. I arrived with a fresh copy of my documentation, dried and reorganized after the previous day's water incident. I also brought photographs of the ergonomic improvements I'd helped residents achieve through voluntary assessments. "Margaret," Janet began, "we need to address the situation that occurred yesterday. Mr. Johnson's assault on my person while I was conducting lawful activities on public property. The incident where you were measuring his mailbox despite being asked to stop. I was conducting a voluntary ergonomic assessment. Margaret, you weren't invited to assess his mailbox. You've been measuring the same properties repeatedly for months after being asked to stop." I consulted my notebook. Consistent monitoring is essential for ensuring continued compliance. Standards don't maintain themselves. Board member Rick Patterson leaned forward. "Margaret, how often are you measuring each mailbox?" "It varies based on compliance history and risk factors. New installations require daily monitoring for the first week to ensure proper settling. Previously non-compliant properties need weekly checks to prevent regression. Consistently compliant properties can be checked monthly." "Daily monitoring?" Patricia Williams looked shocked. "You're measuring some mailboxes every day?" Only new installations and recent corrections, I clarified. Proper installation verification requires systematic observation. The board members exchanged looks again. I was beginning to recognize this pattern as a sign of their failure to appreciate systematic methodology. Margaret, Janet said carefully, the board has decided that your approach to mailbox compliance has become disruptive to the community. We're asking you to resign from the board. The words hung in the air for a moment.
Resign?
From the position that allowed me to maintain community standards? On what grounds?
I asked.
Resident complaints, harassment allegations, and, well, the board feels your behavior has become obsessive. Obsessive. There was that word again. As if systematic attention to detail were somehow pathological rather than professional. Janet, I have documented 347 properties, issued over 200 violation notices, and helped dozens of residents achieve ergonomic improvements. How is that obsessive? Margaret, you follow mail carriers around the neighborhood. You take photographs of people's mailboxes. You measure the same mailboxes multiple times per week. Residents are afraid of you. Afraid of me? I was helping them understand proper standards and achieve ergonomic improvements. How could anyone be afraid of that? I'm maintaining community standards, I said. If residents are afraid of standards, that says more about them than it does about me. The meeting ended with an ultimatum: resign from the board voluntarily, or face a formal removal vote at the next monthly meeting. Either way, my official involvement in HOA activities was over. I drove home through the familiar streets of Willowbrook Estates, past mailboxes I had measured dozens of times. Some were now in perfect compliance thanks to my efforts. Others remained stubbornly non-compliant, their owners apparently comfortable with mediocrity. But as I sat in my driveway that night, looking at my own mailbox, 43 inches exactly, verified monthly, I realized something important. The HOA board could remove me from my official position, but they couldn't remove the knowledge I'd gained or the standards I'd internalized. I had become something more than an HOA board member. I had become a guardian of precision in a world increasingly comfortable with close enough. The next morning, I resumed my measurements. Not as an official HOA representative, but as a concerned citizen committed to community improvement. I had identified a problem: widespread mailbox height non-compliance, and I had developed expertise in addressing that problem. The board's political decision to abandon enforcement didn't change the underlying need for monitoring and correction. I adjusted my methodology slightly to avoid further complaints. Instead of carrying my official clipboard, I used a small digital device to record measurements. Instead of approaching residents directly, I focused on documentation and education through anonymous flyers left in mailboxes, properly positioned ones only, of course. The flyers explained the ergonomic benefits of proper mailbox height and included simple instructions for self-assessment. I also created a website, mailboxcompliance.org, where residents could submit their measurements for evaluation and receive personalized recommendations. The response to these new approaches was encouraging. Several residents began measuring their own mailboxes and making adjustments without any direct contact from me. The website received over 50 visits in its first month, with 12 residents submitting measurements for evaluation. But I still maintained my systematic monitoring of the neighborhood. Standards don't maintain themselves, and someone needed to track compliance trends and identify emerging problems. That's how I discovered the conspiracy. It was a Thursday morning in August when I noticed something unusual. I was conducting my weekly survey of Oak Street when I observed Carmen Rodriguez, the postal worker, engaged in suspicious behavior at 1847 Oak Street. Instead of simply delivering mail to the now-compliant 42 3/4-inch mailbox, she was examining the installation closely. She appeared to be checking something specific about the mounting hardware. When she finished, she made a note in a small book she carried. This was highly irregular. In over a year of observing postal workers, I had never seen one take notes about mailbox installations. I documented the incident carefully and continued my observations over the following days. The pattern became clear within a week. Carmen was systematically examining mailboxes that had been recently adjusted to achieve compliance, specifically mailboxes that had been corrected following my violation notices. She was paying particular attention to the mounting hardware and making notes about each installation. On Friday morning, I observed her speaking with Mrs. Chun about her recently adjusted mailbox. The conversation was brief, but I could see Carmen pointing to various aspects of the installation. When she finished her mail delivery, she made another note in her book. That afternoon, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Chen's mailbox, which had been at exactly 43 inches for 3 months, was now sitting at 44.5 inches, 1.5 inches over regulation. Someone had deliberately sabotaged a compliant installation. I immediately conducted measurements on other recently corrected properties. The results were shocking. The Rodriguez family mailbox, previously corrected to 43 inches, was now at 41.25 inches. Mrs. Peterson's mailbox had been lowered from 43 inches to 41.75 inches. The Thompson mailbox was now at 44.18 inches, up from perfect compliance. 7 properties that had achieved compliance through my efforts had been deliberately altered to create new violations. Someone was systematically undermining my work. The evidence pointed to a coordinated effort. The changes weren't random. They showed knowledge of proper mailbox height and deliberate adjustment to create specific violations. This wasn't accidental settling or gradual noncompliance. This was sabotage. I began conducting surveillance to identify the perpetrators. The optimal observation time was between midnight and 4 a.m., when mailbox alterations would be least likely to be witnessed by residents. I positioned myself in my car at various locations throughout the neighborhood, using binoculars to monitor suspicious activity. On the 3rd night of surveillance, I observed something that confirmed my worst suspicions. A dark sedan drove slowly down Elm Street, stopping at several recently corrected mailboxes. 2 individuals emerged from the vehicle and began working on the installations with small tools. I was too far away to identify the individuals clearly, but their behavior was unmistakably criminal. They worked quickly and systematically, adjusting mailbox heights before moving to the next target. When they finished, they drove away without turning on their headlights. I immediately documented the incident and began planning a more comprehensive surveillance operation. If there was an organized effort to undermine mailbox compliance in Willowbrook Estates, I needed evidence that would stand up in court. The next morning, I measured the mailboxes the vandals had targeted. Every single one had been altered. 1456 Elm Street, lowered from 43 inches to 39.5 inches. 1461 Elm Street, raised from 43 inches to 45.25 inches. 1467 Elm Street, lowered from 43 inches to 41 inches. The pattern was clear. Someone with detailed knowledge of my compliance work was systematically reversing successful corrections. This wasn't random vandalism. This was targeted harassment designed to undermine community standards and discredit my enforcement efforts. I called the police to report the vandalism, but Officer Martinez seemed skeptical about the seriousness of the crime. So someone adjusted the height of some mailboxes? Someone deliberately altered properly positioned mailboxes to create violations. I corrected. This is vandalism of community property and harassment of residents who had achieved compliance. Mrs. Pemberton, I understand you're concerned about mailbox heights, but adjusting a mailbox isn't exactly breaking and entering. It's destruction of property and conspiracy to undermine community standards. I'll file a report, but honestly, this doesn't sound like something we can investigate extensively. The police response was disappointing but not surprising. They didn't understand the broader implications of what was happening. This wasn't just about mailbox heights. This was about the systematic destruction of community order. I decided to conduct my own investigation. Over the following weeks, I intensified my surveillance efforts and expanded my documentation. I installed a small video camera in my car to record any suspicious activity, and I began tracking the movements of residents who might have access to information about my compliance work. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when I observed Carmen Rodriguez engaged in another suspicious interaction. She was speaking with Mr. Johnson, the same Mr. Johnson who had assaulted me with a garden hose, at his mailbox. The conversation lasted several minutes, and I could see Carmen pointing to various properties along the street. When she finished her conversation, She made extensive notes in her book. That afternoon, I observed Mr. Johnson walking around the neighborhood, stopping at several mailboxes and examining their mounting hardware. The conspiracy was becoming clear. Carmen Rodriguez was providing information about recently corrected mailboxes to residents who opposed compliance enforcement. Those residents were then coordinating efforts to sabotage compliant installations and create new violations. This explained everything. How the saboteurs knew which mailboxes to target, how they knew the original compliance status, and how they were able to work so systematically. Carmen Rodriguez, a federal employee, was actively participating in the undermining of community standards. I documented this discovery carefully and began preparing a comprehensive report for the Postal Inspector General, the FBI, and the local district attorney. This was no longer a simple HOA matter. This was a federal crime involving mail service employees and community property destruction. But before I could submit my report, something happened that changed everything. I was conducting routine surveillance on Oak Street when I noticed unusual activity at my own house. A vehicle I didn't recognize was parked in my driveway, and someone was working on my mailbox. I drove home immediately to confront the intruders, but by the time I arrived, they were gone. My mailbox, which had been at exactly 43 inches that morning, was now sitting at 38 3/4 inches. They had targeted me directly. I stood in my driveway, measuring my own mailbox and feeling a rage I'd never experienced before. These people had violated my property, destroyed my compliance status, and attacked the very symbol of my commitment to community standards. But they had made a critical error. By targeting me directly, they had escalated from community vandalism to personal harassment. And unlike other residents who might be intimidated by such tactics, I was prepared to fight back. I spent that night developing a comprehensive counter-strategy. If there was an organized conspiracy against mailbox compliance in Willowbrook Estates, I would identify every participant and document every crime. I would gather evidence that even the most skeptical authorities couldn't ignore. The next morning, I adjusted my mailbox back to exactly 43 inches and installed a hidden security camera to monitor any future vandalism attempts. I also began expanding my surveillance to cover a wider area, tracking the movements of suspected conspirators and documenting their communications. Within a week, I had identified at least 12 residents who were actively participating in the sabotage efforts. They had developed a sophisticated network for sharing information about recently corrected mailboxes and coordinating adjustment activities. Carmen Rodriguez was clearly providing inside information, but several residents were serving as operational coordinators. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed one more piece to complete the case: direct footage of the vandalism in progress. On a Thursday night in September, my security camera captured exactly what I needed. The footage showed two individuals approaching my mailbox with tools, measuring the current height, and deliberately adjusting it to create a violation. The video was clear enough to identify both individuals, Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson, the same Mrs. Patterson who had thanked me for helping her achieve ergonomic improvement with her own mailbox height. She was now participating in efforts to undermine the very standards that had helped her. The betrayal was stunning, but it also provided the final evidence I needed to prove the existence of an organized conspiracy against community mailbox compliance. I prepared my comprehensive report that night, including photographs, video footage, measurement data, and detailed timelines of the vandalism campaign. The evidence was irrefutable: a coordinated effort involving a federal employee and multiple residents to systematically undermine community standards and harass citizens committed to compliance. But as I sat at my kitchen table at 3 a.m., organizing evidence and preparing criminal complaints, I realized something that changed my perspective on everything that had happened. I wasn't just fighting for mailbox compliance anymore. I had become the guardian of precision itself in a world that seemed determined to accept mediocrity. The mailboxes were just the beginning, the visible symbol of a deeper commitment to standards, measurement, and truth. The conspiracy against me wasn't really about mailbox heights. It was about the fundamental human resistance to being held accountable to objective standards. People preferred comfortable approximation to accurate measurement, convenient compliance to precise correctness. But someone had to stand for precision. Someone had to insist that 43 inches meant exactly 43 inches, not close enough, or good enough, or whatever works. Someone had to maintain the mathematical certainty that kept civilization from devolving into chaos. I had become that someone. The next morning, I submitted my criminal complaints to the appropriate authorities and resumed my daily measurements. But I was no longer just monitoring mailbox compliance. I was defending the principle of precision itself against an organized campaign of approximation and mediocrity. And I realized that this was bigger than Willowbrook Estates. If the conspiracy could target mailbox compliance here, they could undermine measurement standards anywhere. Someone needed to take a broader view to protect precision on a larger scale. I began researching measurement standards in other communities, documenting violations in nearby neighborhoods, and building a network of citizens committed to mathematical accuracy in public installations. The work was expanding, but it was necessary work. Because in the end, standards are either enforced precisely, or they become meaningless suggestions. And I had become the person who understood that truth more clearly than anyone else. As I write this, it's been 18 months since I began measuring mailboxes in Willowbrook Estates. My documentation now covers over 2,000 properties across 17 neighborhoods. I've identified compliance violations in 67% of installations, documented sabotage efforts in 4 communities, and established a growing network of citizens committed to measurement accuracy. The work continues. Every morning, I drive through neighborhoods with my measuring tape, my digital camera, and my red notebook. I document violations, educate residents, and maintain the precise standards that keep our communities functioning. Some people call me obsessive. Some call me crazy. But I know what I am. I'm the person who understands that the difference between 42 and 3/4 inches and 43 inches is the difference between order and chaos. And someone has to measure that difference. Someone has to stand guard over precision itself.